Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne, beginning this time with a bit of a novelty. Enlarged Head, one of the enlarged heads of a church patient. Inside it is a cavity just large enough for a person to wear it on their head, but the sane would never think to wear this. But if one listens carefully, one might get the feeling one can hear the damp sound. Gurgle gurgle. Slowly, from the depths of water, like dripping. And if there were any doubt of this being a joke item, consider how silly our character looks when it's equipped. Given the humorous presentation, I'm also inclined to read the final part of the description as something of a parody of what we've heard the patients in the research hall say so far. Still, what impresses me about the description is how thoroughly those two short lines reference the other phrases we've heard from the patients. And to the translator's credit, they've done an admirable job of maintaining these references in English while also being flexible enough to have them make sense in their new context. This is perhaps most obvious at the start of the second to last line, where the Japanese uses the exact same form of a phrase we've encountered before. That would be mimi o sumaseba, which is used to refer to the act of listening to something intently. We first ran into it when we approached the patient banging his head against a wall up in the rafters, with the full official English quote being, "Listen close, and you too will hear the sound of water." In the case of the enlarged head description, this is instead translated as "listen carefully." So, unlike the Japanese, the wording is slightly different, even if the overall idea is the same. Also, keep in mind that in the new context of this item description, the purpose of the line is not to sound like the mad declaration of a research hall patient, but to call back to it in a kind of parody, so using the more familiar phrasing of "listen carefully" as opposed to "listen closely" makes sense. For an example where each language uses the same wording in both description and dialogue, though, we need look no further than the second half of this same line. Here we see a reference to the sticky sound that Adeline mentioned, which is once again being used as the translation for shimetta oto in Japanese. This is an important term to keep the same, because doing so implies a continuity between the water sounds the other patients hear and the sound that Adeline describes as sticky. If we can trust this information despite the overall humorous tone of the description, that's highly relevant to how all this ends up fitting together. But there's still one more specific translation choice I want to highlight in the immediate context of this item description, because the start of the next line involves a case where the English contains a literal callback that the Japanese does not. Shitori shitori is a unique onomatopoeic phrase that indicates the sound of water or wetness, whereas drip drop is an example of a water sound we've heard before. I translated this gurgle gurgle in my literal version to emphasize this contrast, but ultimately I think the official translation has the correct approach. I say that for two reasons. First, part of the point of this line is to make us think of the water-related onomatopoeia we've heard before, which drip drop does just fine. And second, as we learn from the latter half of the Japanese, the sound that's being described is explicitly said to be slow and similar to dripping. There's simply no way a phrase like gurgle gurgle is better at conveying that idea than drip drop. So on the whole, despite moving both towards and away from literal quotations when compared to the Japanese, the official translation does a great job of referencing what's come before in the new context of this description. All the major ideas come through, letting us know that if we listen intently, we may hear a watery or sticky sound resembling dripping down in the watery depths. Furthermore, the thoroughness of this recounting, right down to the use of onomatopoeia, both makes it an effective parody and helps tie in Adeline's experience with that of the other research hall patients. Speaking of which, I've been loading and reloading the research hall off camera, and now I think it's time we check back in with Adeline to see how she's doing. That's a new look. How are you feeling?
Oh, hello. One last time. Will you fetch brain fluid just one last time? The murky, mushy fluid that will make me whole. The sticky sound whispers to me. So very close, right into my ear. My head, just a head, that's all there is. I need my baptism. Please, I beg of you. I want to be something.
You already are something. Are you sure about this?
Please, give me brain fluid. The sticky sound whispers I need my baptism. Or perhaps I'm already brimming over.
Okay, but you're the last head blob, so... I hope that didn't hurt too much. In terms of translation choices involved in those sets of lines, though, there's one decision in particular that I think is both fascinating in its own right and relevant to Adeline's current state. That would be the way she talks about the necessity of receiving a baptism in English, as opposed to requesting a first bath in Japanese. On a purely linguistic level, this is interesting because there are various words in Japanese both for the concept of baptism and the process of undergoing it, such as sende, shinde, jusen, and jushin. But none of those terms are involved here. Instead, what we see in the subtitles is the non-Christian term ubuyu. Literally, this is simply a term for the first bath given to a newborn, though according to the Encyclopedia Nipponica, it has some additional cultural significance of its own. From what I can gather, it seems to be tied to a number of rituals that take place on the third day after a baby is born. So, on one level, this seems like an interesting bit of localization where one symbolic act of washing is being substituted for another. However, I think the connection goes deeper than that, which we can see if we consider Adeline's situation. Essentially, I don't think it's an accident that she's asking for this now that she's physically undergone the transformation that was verbally foreshadowed in her last set of dialogues. Her new body marks the start of a fundamentally different kind of existence, and both the act of baptism and the performance of ubuyu are associated with the beginning of a new life. In other words, Adeline is telling us she needs a ritual involving water to mark her rebirth as a head blob. Even considering the equivalence of this core idea across the two languages, though, if we factor in the Catholic trappings of the Healing Church, I actually think the term baptism fits the setting better than the Japanese ubuyu. Nor is that the only translation decision that I think works out favorably for the English. I'm also pleased with the way the translators decided to have Adeline say she wants to be something, as opposed to the alternative phrasing of become something that I used in my own rougher version of the line. It's a subtle difference, and the Japanese verb is vague enough to support either interpretation, but I think the official English does a better job of highlighting that what Adeline really wants is to reach a particular state. After all, it's not literal rank or any kind of deed that makes the great ones great. It's about the very nature of their existence encompassing a higher level of reality than humans can comprehend. If this phrase were translated as become something, that emphasis on simple existence wouldn't be quite as strong. Either way, though, I appreciate how well this particular line ties in with Adeline's request for baptism, because it's more evidence of her desire to start anew that I think is meant to be an underlying theme. This isn't even a concept limited to Adeline's own dialogue, which is plain enough to see if we consider that quote about being a robin and wanting to become an egg. It's all about beginning again as a blank slate and embracing a new state of being after already having lived as a lesser one. But before we baptize Adeline with brain fluid to see what does become of her, let's take a closer look at this final variation of a familiar item. Brain fluid. Dim amoeboid brain fluid. Possesses a wobbly elasticity. Thing extracted from a patient whose head swelled until finally they became only a head. One lacks self-awareness of a thing within, then that thing is lost and one realizes. It's comical, but that is also the nature of enlightenment, like licking one's own blood and being surprised by its sweetness. For such an important item, its description is surprisingly focused on the way in which we acquired it, as opposed to providing new information on the history of the research hall or the nature of Adeline's transformation. But despite both this unexpected turn and the relatively straightforward translation, there are still a couple smaller points related to this brain fluid that I want to discuss. First, while we're seeing the familiar use of insight in English as opposed to the more literal term enlightenment, there's an aspect of how it's being used here that I think makes it worth bringing up again. That's because in the context of this particular item description, I would argue that the official English makes more sense than the Japanese. To see this, let's start by going over what we know about the term keimo. Way back in episode 2 of Translationborne, I noted the distinctly rational and instructive connotations of this word, pointing out that while it's often translated as enlightenment, it should be understood more in the vein of Enlightenment philosophy, or the historical period called the Enlightenment, rather than in the Buddhist sense of obtaining spiritual enlightenment. So my question is, how can rational knowledge gained through instruction by its very nature be something that people would fail to appreciate having until it's gone? Now, it's not like this is an unanswerable question. Not realizing how far you've come on an intellectual endeavor is a real phenomenon, one that I experienced myself while learning Japanese, when I would frequently underrate my own abilities. But while the phrasing of the original does ultimately make sense to me, I think it's easier to intuitively understand the idea of not valuing one's own insight, as the official English has it. I take this as another example of how large a role context plays in translation, and I think it also illustrates some of the benefits of choosing insight as a term, beyond just the play on words that ties it to the idea of eyes on the inside. It simply lines up better with the more mystical aspects of Bloodborne. While the continued translation of keimo as insight stresses the variation that context can bring though, the second aspect of this item description that I want to highlight involves the exact opposite effect. There's actually a shared term in the Japanese between all of the brain fluids in the enlarged head piece of attire, which is translated differently in English. That would be the word hidai, and its primary meaning is to swell up, to grow enlarged, or to become fat. This is the term used to describe both the heads of the patients who we extracted the brain fluid from, as well as the piece of attire we can put on our head to look like them. In English, two different terms, expanded and enlarged, are used instead. However, unlike some earlier occasions when I brought up shared terminology linking things together in Japanese, I don't think the use of different terms in English is going to surprise anyone in this particular case. Among other things, that's because the visual tie to the head blobs is so strong, which I think provides an interesting, if fairly mundane example of how sometimes other aspects of a video game can simplify, rather than complicate, a translator's job. Anyway, now that we've had the chance to examine the brain fluid we got from Adeline, I think it's time we baptized her in a liquid that represents her own understanding and see what happens. Hey Adeline, are you ready?
Please, give me brain fluid. The sticky sound whispers I need my baptism. Or perhaps I'm already brimming over.
You were. That's where I got this.
I see a shape. My guide, I see your voice. Clearly as it bends and bleeds. My own revelation. Just for me. Thank you for everything. Really, I used to be nothing.
I guess that revelation was too much for her. And because her words are also fairly obscure, both in English and in Japanese, I want to take some time to break down what I see as the culmination of practically everything we've experienced in the research hall. For me, it all turns on the first two coherent lines Adeline has after taking in the brain fluid we extracted from her. In the first of these lines, Adeline recognizes that she is seeing a shape. Here the Japanese is arguably a bit more expressive, because she literally opens by using the word for that, indicating that there's something specific she's referring to which she's suddenly recognized must be a shape. The official English makes it sound as if a shape has simply appeared in her vision, and in a sense, it seems like that's accurate, but as we move on to the next line, I think knowing that Adeline is identifying something out there which she's perceiving as a shape helps make sense of her experience. That's because when she says she can see the voice of her guide, I think she's referring to the shape she just saw. In fact, I'm pretty sure we partially share her vision, and that the shape in question is that of the Carol rune we get immediately after she finishes speaking this second line. After all, Carol runes are visual depictions of inhuman sounds, and Adeline has been listening for a very particular non-human noise this whole time, the sticky sound. What's more, based on the things we've seen so far, I believe that sticky sound is in fact the voice of a Great One. That's ultimately the product of some speculation on my part, since there's no outright confirmation of a Great One being involved. But we can say fairly definitively that the sound is a kind of voice, and there are a lot of implications that it belongs to a higher being. To begin with the more easily verifiable claim, though, let's consider the evidence that the sticky sound is a voice. First, note how at one point in both English and Japanese, Adeline says the sound whispers to her, which implies vocal communication. Furthermore, those of you who read through the pinned comment in my previous episode will already know that there's a point even earlier in the Japanese when rather than simply speaking of hearing the sound, Adeline refers to this same auditory phenomenon as the voice that guides her. Then of course there's the line in both languages when Adeline receives her revelation and she addresses her guide, which we know is the sticky sound, and she says she can see its voice. So, while it's not exactly clear who's speaking, some form of auditory communication does seem to be taking place. Now let's consider the clues we've gotten that suggest this voice belongs to a Great One. These mostly consist in what we learn from the brain fluid descriptions. Here we can find out that this experiment is seemingly part of a deliberate attempt to reach the Great Ones by imbibing water, and we already know that Great Ones often answer when called upon. Beyond that, we also learned that brain fluid is connected with internal eye formation, which Willem believed was a crucial step to thinking on a higher level. That means the voice becoming clearer as Adeline took in more brain fluid could be meant to suggest that the sound she was listening to originated on a more elevated plane. Finally, if the phrase encounter with the eldritch truth can indeed be understood as referring to meeting a Great One, as I discussed in some detail back in episode 79, it sounds like there was at least one case that resulted in success. After all, verbal communication with a higher being sounds like an interaction with the divine unknown to me. So while there's no direct evidence that the voice associated with the sticky sound actually belongs to a Great One, it seems like a reasonable interpretation. As a result, the way I'm inclined to read this situation is that Adeline has long been picking up on the voice of a Great One, and in the last moments of her life, she's able to break through the watery barrier and clearly envision its voice in the form of a Carol rune. That is the nature of her private revelation, which we happen to bear witness to, and this makes her case a successful one in the eyes of the Church, like the brother-sister doctor-patient pair who encountered the eldritch truth. This is why I see Adeline's quest as the culmination of practically everything in the research hall. It starts with the mad ravings of the general patients, who go on about water, sounds, and terrors deep below. This suggests the idea of a Great One influencing the minds of humans from across a watery barrier, particularly those who are mad. Then we see the theme taken to its next level with the head blobs, who speak of a gentle dripping at the bottom of the sea, talk of new beginnings, and make water sounds. Intertwined with all this is Adeline's own story. As we give her more and more brain fluid, we also get indications that her capacity for insight is expanding. She follows the guidance of a sticky sound, hears it dripping at the bottom of the sea, and is soon transformed to look like the other head blobs. After she's taken on this new form, Adeline too begins making water sounds and speaks of a new beginning. Notably, she also refers to her former state as being lesser, which is yet another indication that her consciousness has expanded. Finally, she seems to reach a higher plane, and can clearly see the voice of the Great One that's guided her to that point. Her vision becomes a new Carol rune, but it ultimately proves too much even for her elevated mind, and she expires. That last part may explain why the Church ultimately moved on from this sort of approach. But in terms of Adeline's own story, she seems to have been doomed by success. All it really meant for her was a long life as a test subject until she met a dramatic end. It's a story that blends together all we learned in the research hall with a tale that could either be seen as a triumph or a personal tragedy, which seems to me like a good point to go out on. Next time, I'll be back to my more typical focus on translation analysis, so I hope you'll join me for that as we work through the last of the items relevant to Adeline's story. In the meantime, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, please let me know. Or if you'd like to hear my thoughts on any of the other subjects I've covered so far, remember that you can check the Translationborne index linked below, which should be up to date within 24 hours. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.